You're ruining the vibe, Haley. Honestly, just look at yourself. Jacqueline's voice sliced through the humid Charleston air, sharper than the sweet tea she pretended to sip. She was leaning against the granite island in my kitchen. The kitchen I had restored with my own hands, looking at me like I was a stain on the floorboards. My brother Antonio stood beside her, swirling a glass of bourbon he hadn't paid for. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was too busy admiring the reflection of his tuxedo in the window, rehearsing the role of the lord of the manor he so desperately wanted to play. We need to talk about the living arrangements, Jacqueline continued, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Before the wedding, Antonio and I need space. We need to start our life together without baggage. Baggage. That's what she called the person who paid the mortgage. The person who kept the roof from leaking and the lights on. I looked at Antonio. He finally turned to me, his face flushed with a mix of arrogance and fear. He knew what he was about to say was a line he couldn't uncross. You're jealous, Haley, he spat out, the words rehearsed. You're jealous because Mom left the house to me. Because I'm the one getting married and building a future and you're just here. He took a step closer, puffing out his chest. So here's the deal. The greatest wedding gift you could give us is disappearing from our lives forever. We want you out. By Saturday. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. The old Haley, the one who kept the peace, would have begged. She would have tried to explain the logic, the finances, the sheer insanity of evicting the only person with a job. But that Haley died the moment those words left his mouth. Understood, I said. My voice was calm. Terrifyingly calm. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them standing in the silence of their own victory. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I closed the door to my bedroom and turned the lock. The click was soft, barely a whisper in the old house, but it felt like a gunshot. Down the hall I could hear them laughing. The clinking of glasses. The heavy, confident footsteps of a man who thought he had just won a war without firing a shot. They probably imagined I was in here crying, throwing clothes into a suitcase, mourning the loss of the only home I had ever known. They were wrong. I wasn't mourning. I was calculating. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the room I had painted, the shelves I had built, the life I had curated within these walls. But I didn't look at the photos or the keepsakes. I pulled up the inventory list I had created 6 months ago, the day I first noticed money missing from the joint account. Antonio called himself an entrepreneur. He liked to use words like infrastructure and scalability at dinner parties to impress people who didn't know any better. He pointed to the renovated carriage garage, the climate-controlled high-security server room humming with $28,000 worth of AI processors and crypto mining hardware, and told everyone it was his tech wing. He loved the way the blue LED lights looked in the dark. He loved the noise the cooling fans made like a jet engine idling. He loved the idea of it. But he didn't own it. I scrolled down the spreadsheet. Invoice after invoice. Receipt after receipt. Every processor, every graphic card, every cable, and every cooling unit was purchased with a credit card that bore only one name. I leaned back in my chair, listening to his muffled laughter through the wall. That was the tragedy of Antonio. He wasn't born a monster. He was crafted into one layer by a family that refused to let him fail. Our mother had shielded him from every sharp edge of the world. If he broke a window, it was the wind. If he failed a class, the teacher was incompetent. She had built a throne for him out of excuses and cushioned it with my sacrifices. He grew up believing that being the man of the house was a title you inherited, not a job you did. He thought respect was something you demanded, like a refill on a drink. And Jacqueline? She was a predator who had found the perfect prey. She didn't fall in love with him. She identified a vacuum. She saw a man desperate to be the king his mother told him he was, and she handed him a crown made of cardboard. She fed his delusion because it made him easy to steer. She whispered in his ear that I was the villain, that I was the one holding him back, because she knew that as long as I was in the picture she couldn't strip the house bare. She pumped him full of helium until he floated so high he couldn't see the cliff he was standing on. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had saved under, in case of emergency. Russell answered on the second ring. He was a forensic accountant who had worked with our family for years, the only one who saw through Antonio's charm. Haley, his voice was rough with sleep. It's 10 o'clock. I know, I said, my voice steady. I'm initiating the liquidation protocol. The servers. The hardware. All of it. There was a pause on the line. You're sure? Once we start this, there's no undo button. It's a fire sale. I'm sure, I said. I have a buyer in Atlanta who wants the processors for parts. Send the contract. I want them gone by tomorrow night. And the house? Russell asked quietly. The house is his, I said, looking at the ceiling where a water stain I had fixed last winter was just starting to fade. For now. I hung up the phone. I stood up and walked to the closet. I didn't pack a bag. I grabbed a single box. I put my passport in it. My hard drive. The photo of my mother. The one taken before she got sick, before she rewrote the will that would destroy us both. I wasn't leaving because I was defeated. I was leaving because you don't stay inside a building when you've just lit the fuse. I walked to the window and looked out at the carriage garage. The blue lights of the servers pulsed in the darkness, a heartbeat of money and power that Antonio thought belonged to him. "Enjoy the silence, brother," I whispered, "because it's going to get very quiet around here. People always ask why I stayed. Why I let a 26-year-old man live in my house rent-free, why I paid for his mistakes, why I let him treat me like an employee in my own home. They don't understand the chain. It's not made of iron. It's made of guilt. It's made of the last words a dying woman whispers to you in a hospital room that smells like antiseptic and fear. Take care of your brother, Haley. He needs you. He's not strong like you." That was the trap. The invisible chain of the survivor. When our mother died 3 years ago, I didn't just inherit a house. I inherited a child. Antonio was 23 then, but he grieved like a toddler, loud, demanding, and utterly helpless. And I grieved like a soldier. I buried my pain so I could carry his. I thought I was being a good sister. I thought I was honoring her memory. But looking back at the empty hallway, I realized I hadn't been a sister. I had been a human shield. I remembered the winter the roof started leaking. It was 2 in the morning, freezing rain lashing against the siding. Water was dripping onto the hardwood in the hallway, a steady, maddening rhythm. I was on a ladder with a tarp and a bucket, my hands numb, trying to save the floorboards. Antonio was in the living room. I could hear the explosions from his video game. I asked him to help, just to hold the ladder. "I can't pause it, Haley," he had shouted over the sound of gunfire. "It's a ranked match. Just call a guy. Call a guy." As if money grew in the garden. I didn't call a guy. I fixed the roof myself. I paid for the materials with the money I had saved for a vacation I never took. And the next morning, when Antonio complained that the banging kept him awake, I apologized. That was the sickness. The learned helplessness. I had taught him that if I ignored a problem long enough, I would solve it. I had taught him that his comfort was the priority and my survival was the backup plan. I walked over to the bookshelf and picked up a framed photo of the two of us from that first year. We were smiling, but my eyes looked tired. Dead tired. I had funded 3 of his startups. The dropshipping business that consisted of him buying inventory he never shipped. The fitness app that was just a sketch on a napkin. And finally, the crypto mining rig. Every time I hesitated, every time I tried to say no, he would pull on the chain. "Mom wanted us to help each other. You know I'm trying. Why don't you believe in me?" He weaponized my competence against me. He made me feel guilty for having a job, for having savings, for being able to function when he claimed he couldn't. He convinced me that my stability was a privilege I owed him a tax on. But tonight, looking at the dust outlines on the shelves where my things used to be, the chain didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt brittle. I realized I hadn't been saving him. I had been crippling him. By cushioning every fall, I had robbed him of the only thing that teaches a man how to walk: gravity. I wasn't leaving him to die. I was leaving him to live. To face the cold without a coat. To fix his own roof. I placed the photo face down on the shelf. The sister who apologized for taking up space was gone. The woman who stood in the dark room now wasn't a savior. She was a ghost. And ghosts don't pay mortgages. 3 days before the wedding, I came home to a silence so heavy it felt like it had mass. Usually when I unlocked the front door, the floorboards vibrated. Baxter, our red Tibetan Mastiff, weighed 160 pounds. He didn't trot, he thundered. He was the lion of the house, the last living heartbeat of the family we used to be. Tonight the hallway was still. The water bowl in the foyer was bone dry. The massive orthopedic bed in the corner was gone. I walked into the living room. Antonio was sitting on the sofa, scrolling through his phone, a half-eaten pizza box on the coffee table. He looked up, his expression a mix of defiance and boredom. "Where is he?" I asked. My voice was low. "Relax," Antonio said, not putting his phone down. "I handled it. We needed liquidity for the venue deposit. The island estate required a wire transfer by 5 o'clock. Where is the dog, Antonio?" "He's with a breeder in Savannah," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Guy offered $45,000 cash. Do you know how much overhead that dog was costing us? The food alone was bleeding me dry. Bleeding him dry. I paid for the food. I paid for the vet bills. I paid for the air conditioning that kept the dog cool in the summer." "You sold Mom's dog," I said. "To pay for a party." "I sold an asset," he corrected, standing up. "Jacqueline deserves the perfect day. And frankly, that beast smelled. It wasn't fitting for the lifestyle we're building here. I did us a favor." He looked at me, waiting for the explosion. Waiting for the tears. He wanted me to scream so he could call me crazy. He wanted a reaction he could use to justify kicking me out. I didn't give it to him. I looked at the empty spot where the dog bed used to be. I thought about the nights after Mom died, when Baxter would rest his massive head on my lap and just breathe, keeping me anchored to the earth when I felt like floating away. Antonio hadn't just sold a dog. He had sold his soul. And in doing so he had unknowingly signed his own eviction notice. 45,000, I repeated. Cash. Cash, he smirked. Business is business, Haley. Right, I said. Business. I turned around and walked out the door. I didn't go to my car immediately. I stood on the porch, inhaling the scent of jasmine and impending rain. I pulled out my phone and called the number for the breeder Antonio had mentioned once before, a man he had bragged about meeting at a car show. It took me 2 hours to drive to the outskirts of Savannah. The breeder operated out of a warehouse that smelled of bleach and misery. He wasn't happy to see me, but he was happy to see the cash. I didn't use the money from my savings. I used the cash from the liquidation of the server room. The money Antonio thought was his future was now buying back his past mistakes. I had to pay $50,000 to get him back, a $5,000 stupidity tax on my brother's greed. When Baxter saw me, he let out a low rumbling whine that vibrated in my chest. I buried my face in his thick red fur, smelling the warehouse stink on him, and I made him a promise. You're never going back there. I drove him to a private kennel run by a friend, a place with acres of grass and no brothers looking for a quick payday. I paid for a month in advance. Driving back to Charleston, the road stretched out in front of me like a dark ribbon. I wasn't sad anymore. The grief had burned off, leaving something harder underneath. Antonio thought he had cleared the board. He thought getting rid of the dog was the final move to secure his dominion over the house. He didn't know that by selling Baxter he had triggered the one clause in our mother's will that he had never bothered to read. He thought he was the king of the castle. He didn't realize he was just a tenant who had just violated his lease. I pulled into the driveway. The lights were off. He was probably sleeping, dreaming of his island wedding and his wealthy future. Sleep tight, Antonio. Because the wake-up call is going to be brutal. The office of Russell and Associates smelled of mahogany and old money. It was the kind of place where fortunes were protected and legacies were enforced. I sat across from Russell, a man who had known my mother since before I was born. He didn't look like a lawyer today. He looked like an executioner. You were right about Jacqueline, I said, sliding a tablet across the desk. I tracked her IP address from the investment portal, she showed Antonio. It's a mirror site. The layout is cloned from a legitimate exchange, but the back-end routes directly to an offshore wallet in the Caymans. It's a classic Ponzi structure. Russell glanced at the screen, his expression unreadable. $450,000, he murmured. That's what Antonio leveraged against the house? That's what the hard money lender gave him, I corrected. Cash. Delivered yesterday. He handed it straight to Jacqueline. So he's broke, Russell said. He's worse than broke, I said. He's a victim of a federal crime. But that's not why I'm here. Russell nodded. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a thick document bound in blue paper. The last will and testament of Elena Vance. Your mother was a kind woman, Haley, Russell said, opening the document. But she wasn't blind. She loved Antonio, but she knew his nature. She knew that if she gave him power without guardrails, he would drive off a cliff. He turned the document to face me, pointing to a paragraph on page 12. This is what we call dead hand control, Russell explained. It's a concept in property law. Most people bequeath assets in fee simple absolute, meaning you own it, you can sell it, you can burn it down. Your mother didn't do that. I read the text. The legalese was dense, but the meaning was razor sharp. To my son Antonio, I bequeath the carriage house estate in fee simple determinable. Fee simple determinable, Russell said. He owned the house only as long as a condition was met. Not a request, an automatic rule written into the deed. He tapped the page. That condition was the continued care of the Tibetan Mastiff, Baxter. The instant that condition was violated, the property reverted to the remainder man. Me, I said. You, Russell confirmed. No judge. No eviction. It happens by law. He pulled up 2 timestamps. Baxter's microchip was scanned at 4:15 p.m. yesterday. Official transfer of custody. The mortgage Antonio signed was notarized at 5:30. I understood immediately. He sold the dog at 4:15, which means he lost the house at 4:15. When he signed the mortgage, he no longer owned the collateral. Correct, Russell said. That's mortgage fraud. A felony. The lender will call the loan, and the cash is already gone. He closed the file. Your mother didn't leave a will. She left a trap. Greed was the trigger. The wedding reception was already underway when we arrived. White tents, string lights, champagne, and stolen money. Antonio stood glowing at the head table, Jacqueline beside him, queenly and smug. I stepped into the tent with Russell, 2 federal agents, and a sheriff. I brought your gift, I said. Every guest found an envelope under their plate. Inside, the dog's bill of sale at 4:15. The mortgage at 5:30. And one line of text. At 4:15 p.m. the groom sold the house. At 5:30 p.m. he pledged what he no longer owned. Understanding rippled through the room. Antonio went gray. Agents cuffed him. Mortgage fraud. Wire fraud. Conspiracy. Jacqueline tried to slip away. She didn't make it far. Her scheme had already caught up with her. Antonio begged me to fix it. You don't own the house anymore, I said quietly. You traded it for greed. I left him there. Later, at the empty carriage house, Baxter hopped out of the car and claimed the yard like it had always been his. The house was silent, clean, finished. I realized then, leaving wasn't punishment. It was the only way to end the cycle. I drove away without looking back. The road ahead was mine,